Our divorce was the quietest thing that ever ruined me. No affair, no screaming, just two people who loved each other going numb at the same time and mistaking it for the end. She kept the house. I never went back. For 7 years I drove the long way around town just to avoid that street. And then she found me, and she whispered 5 words I never thought I'd hear: "Come home with me." Just this once, and I realized she was about to make me walk back into the one room I'd spent 7 years running from. Let me back up, because a sentence like that doesn't mean anything until you understand what those 7 years cost me, and how two people who never once raised their voices still managed to take each other apart. I'm Ethan Cole. I'm 43, and I'm a Finnish carpenter. I do the last, careful work on a house, the part people actually run their hands over. Trim, cabinets, staircases, the mantel above the fireplace. It's the work that makes a building feel like a home instead of a box. And I'm good at it, because I'm patient and because I care about the parts nobody's supposed to notice. There's a joke in that I didn't find funny for a long time. I spend my life making other people's houses into homes, and the one home I ever built for myself, I couldn't set foot in. The house is on Cedar Street, a blue 2-story with a wraparound porch. And I know it better than I know my own hands, because I didn't just live there, I built half of it. When Ruth and I bought it 15 years ago, it was a wreck, a foreclosure with good bones and everything else falling apart, and we got it cheap because nobody else could see what it could be. But I could. Seeing what a wrecked thing could become was my whole trade. So, for 2 years we poured ourselves into it, and I rebuilt that house room by room with my own 2 hands. I hung every door. I built the kitchen cabinets. I made a window seat in the front room, because Ruth said she wanted somewhere to read in the morning light. That house wasn't a building to me. It was a love letter I wrote in wood. Ruth Delgado. She went back to after, though for 11 years she was Ruth Cole. We met when we were both 26, and I'll say plainly that marrying her was the best thing I ever did, and I'll say it plainly because there's no point telling this story if I'm going to be careful with it. She was a labor and delivery nurse. Hold on to that. It matters more than you'd think, and she was warm and quick and stubborn in the best way. And she had this quality I've never found in anyone else, which was that she made an ordinary Tuesday feel like something. We were happy in that house on Cedar Street. Genuinely, uncomplicatedly happy. For a good long while. And then we weren't, and the terrible part, the part that took me 7 years to understand, is that I couldn't have told you the exact day it changed, because it didn't change in a day. It changed in a season. Here's the hard part, the part almost nobody knew. 8 years into the marriage, Ruth got pregnant, and we were so happy it frightened me. I remember standing in the small room at the top of the stairs, the one we'd picked for a nursery, thinking a man isn't supposed to be allowed to be this lucky. I started building a crib, not buying one, building one, in my shop, Walnut, because this child was going to sleep in something her father made. And Ruth, a labor and delivery nurse who spent her whole working life bringing other people's babies safely into the world, started decorating that little room at the top of the stairs. We lost the baby at 6 months. A girl. We'd named her already. We called her Junie, after Ruth's grandmother. And I learned the thing about that kind of grief that nobody warns you about, which is that it doesn't always pull two people together. Sometimes it drives a wedge straight down the middle, because you're both drowning in the same black water and neither of you has the air left to save anybody but yourself. Ruth grieved out loud. She needed to talk about Junie, needed to say her name, needed me to sit in the dark with her and hurt where she could see it. And God help me, I grieved by disappearing. I couldn't look at that little room at the top of the stairs, so I took every job I could, worked 12-hour days, stayed late in other people's houses doing careful trim work because it was easier than coming home to a nursery with no baby in it and a wife whose sadness I had no idea how to fix. I put the half-built walnut crib in the back of my shop under a tarp, and I never touched it again. And every day I wasn't there, Ruth learned to need me a little less, and I told myself her going quiet meant she was healing, when really she was just doing exactly what I was doing, going numb, building a wall, learning to live around the hole instead of standing at the edge of it together. By the time the numbness had done its work, we were two polite strangers in a house I'd built for a family that was never going to exist. We didn't fight. That's what everyone says, like it's a comfort. At least it was amicable, but amicable is its own kind of death. Fighting means there's still current in the wire. We'd gone cold all the way through. And one night Ruth sat on the window seat I'd built her, in the morning light room, except it was evening and there was no light, and she said, so gently it broke me, Ethan, I think we lost each other somewhere back there, and I don't know how to find the way back. And I didn't argue, because I felt it too, and I was too numb and too much of a coward to say then, let's find it, let's go get help. Let's not do this, so I just nodded, and that was the end of 11 years. She kept the house. I want to be clear that I gave it to her. I couldn't imagine living in it, and I couldn't imagine selling it to strangers, so I signed it over and told myself it was generous, when really it was just that I couldn't bear either alternative. I moved into an apartment across town, and I did not set foot inside that house on Cedar Street again for 7 years. I didn't even drive down the street. I mapped my whole life around avoiding it, took the long way to every job on that side of town, turned down work in that neighborhood, built an entire geography of avoidance around one blue house with a wraparound porch, because that house had the little room at the top of the stairs in it, and I would rather have done almost anything than stand in that room again. I told myself a story to survive the 7 years, and the story was that Ruth and I had simply broken, that grief breaks some marriages, that it was nobody's fault, that we'd loved each other and lost a child, and the loss was bigger than we were. And there was nothing to regret because there was nothing either of us could have done. It was a clean story. It let me off the hook for the specific, unforgivable thing I'd actually done, which was disappear on my wife when she needed me most and call it grieving. I built 7 gray years on that clean story. I worked. I got good. Then better, at my trade. I dated a little. Nothing that stuck. Because there was a woman in a house across town who still had the whole deed to me, and I'd never asked for it back. My brother told me once, Ethan, you talk about Ruby like she's dead. She's not dead. She's on Cedar Street. You could knock. I told him some doors you don't knock on. He didn't push. He should have. So, 7 years in, on a Thursday in October, I was loading tools into my truck outside a job across town when I heard someone say my name, and I turned around, and it was Ruth. Ruth, older, softer around the edges, some gray in the dark hair now, and she still stopped my heart cold, the way she had at 26, the way she apparently still could after 7 years of me insisting I was over it. My whole body did something complicated. I hadn't been within 100 feet of this woman since a lawyer's office 7 years ago. Ethan, she said, and her voice shook a little. I've been trying to work up the nerve to find you for a month. I didn't know what to say, so I said the stupid true thing. You found me. I need to ask you something. And I know I have no right, and you can say no. She took a breath, and I watched her steel herself. I'm selling the house. Something dropped in my chest that I wasn't prepared for. 7 years I'd wanted that house gone from my life, and the second she said she was selling it, some animal part of me wanted to say don't. The new owners close on Friday, she said. Tomorrow's the last day it's mine. And before I hand the keys to strangers, I need to ask you. Her voice cracked, and she pushed through it. Come home with me, just this once. There's something in that house I've never been able to do in 7 years, and I can't do it, I can't hand it over, without you there. Please, Ethan, just this once. And I knew the second she said it, I knew exactly which room she meant. And every instinct I'd built over 7 years, every mile of the long way around town, every avoided street, screamed at me to say no, because there was one room in that house I had promised myself I would never stand in again as long as I lived. I said yes. I don't fully know why. Maybe because she'd said just this once, which made it feel survivable. A single closed thing instead of an open door. Maybe because I have never in my life been able to say no to Ruth Delgado. Maybe because 7 years of running from a room is its own kind of prison, and some part of me was so tired of the long way around town. Whatever it was, I heard myself say, okay, Ruth, just this once. We drove separately. That felt important, though I couldn't have said why. And I pulled onto Cedar Street for the first time in 7 years, and there it was, the blue house with the wraparound porch. My love letter in wood, a little weathered but standing, and I sat in my truck at the curb for a full minute before I could make myself get out. Ruth was waiting on the porch I'd built, the railings I'd turned on a lathe one summer while she brought me lemonade and made fun of my sunburn. She had her keys in her hand, and I came up the walk and stopped at the bottom of the steps, and I could not make my feet move, because crossing that threshold meant walking back into the day everything ended, and I'd spent 7 years not doing exactly that. I know, Ruth said softly, watching my face. I stood right there myself, the first day I came back after you moved out. It took me an hour to go in. She held out her hand. Come on, I'll go first. So she went first, and I followed, and I crossed the threshold of my own house for the first time in 7 years. Inside, it hit me like weather. The smell of it, that particular smell a house has that you don't know you remember until you're standing in it. The window seat in the front room, still there, the cushion faded. The kitchen cabinets I'd built, the little burn mark on the counter from a pan Ruth set down wrong the first week. Every board of it was a thing I'd touched, a thing we'd been happy inside of. And I stood in the entryway and felt 7 years of clean, protective numbness start to crack down the middle. You kept the window seat, I said, because it was easier than saying anything true. I kept everything. She said it quietly. That's kind of the whole problem, Ethan. I kept everything. She walked me through it, room by room, and I understood, slowly, that the house was a kind of confession. Because it wasn't just kept, it was frozen. Our photographs were still on the walls. The books were still in the shelves I'd built, in the order we'd left them. The coats in the hall closet, she opened it without a word, still had my old work jacket hanging in it, 7 years later, right where I'd left it. She'd kept a house that a woman who'd truly moved on would have emptied and repainted and made her own years ago. She'd lived for 7 years inside a museum of a marriage she'd told me was over. Ruth, I said, my voice not working right. What is this? You've been living like I haven't been living here, she said. That's the thing. I couldn't live here, but I couldn't sell it either, and I couldn't change it, and I couldn't empty it. I've been in a little apartment on the other side of town for 6 years, Ethan, paying a mortgage on a house I can't live in and can't let go of, and a month ago, I finally admitted to myself that I was going to spend the rest of my life doing that unless I forced my own hand. So I called a realtor before I could talk myself out of it. And then I realized there was one thing I had to do before strangers walked in here, and I couldn't do it alone. She stopped at the bottom of the stairs, and I saw where this was going, and my whole body went cold. It's upstairs. Ruth, I know. Her eyes were wet. I know what I'm asking, but I've never been able to open that door in 7 years, Ethan, not once. And I can't hand this house to strangers knowing they're going to open it, and clear it out, and not even know what it was. I can't let it be just a room to somebody. Please, I can't go up there alone. I've tried. I get to the top of the stairs and I can't. And so we climbed the stairs I'd built, together, one at a time, and we stood outside the door of the little room at the top, the room I'd promised myself I would never stand in again, and Ruth put her hand on the knob and couldn't turn it, and I put my hand over hers, and together we opened the door. It was exactly the way we left it. That's the thing that took the legs out from under me. 7 years, and she hadn't touched it. The walls were still the soft green Ruth had painted, a color for a baby whose sex we hadn't wanted to know. The little curtains she'd sewn were still on the window, and in the corner, under a tarp gone gray with dust, was a shape I knew, and I crossed the room on legs that didn't feel like mine and pulled the tarp back, and it was the crib. The half-finished walnut crib I'd built with my own hands and abandoned in the back of my shop 7 years ago, except it wasn't in my shop, it was here. Finished. Someone had finished it. The rails I'd never sanded were sanded. The joints I'd never pegged were pegged. It was complete, and it was beautiful, and I had not done it. You finished it, I said. I could barely get the words out. I found it in your shop before you cleared it out, Ruth said, and she was crying now, freely, the way she'd needed to cry in front of me 7 years ago, and I'd never let her. After the divorce, I went to your shop to get the last of my things, and I saw it under the tarp. And I couldn't leave it there, Ethan. You'd built it for her. So I took it, and I brought it here, and I paid a man you probably know to finish it exactly the way you would have, and I put it in her room. And then, I couldn't ever come back in here again. She pressed her hand to her mouth. I've been keeping a whole house frozen around a room I couldn't enter. For 7 years. Because I could never once let go of a little girl we never got to bring home. I stood in that room with my hand on the crib I'd built and she'd finished. And 7 years of a clean, protective story about how our marriage had simply broken came apart completely. Because a woman doesn't finish her dead child's crib and keep it in a frozen room for 7 years if she stopped loving the man who started building it. She hadn't moved on. She'd only pretended to. From inside this house, the exact same way I'd pretended to from outside it. 2 people who'd told each other, and the world, that it was over. Both of us guarding the same wound from opposite sides of the same front door for 7 years. I thought you moved on, I said. 7 years, Ruth. I built a whole life around believing you were fine, that you'd let it go. That I was the only one still. I thought you moved on, she said. You left, and you never looked back. You never called. You took the long way around town. I heard about it. This town's small. I thought you couldn't stand the sight of any of it, of me, of what we lost. I thought the kindest thing I could do was disappear into an apartment and let you have your clean start. She wiped her face. And the whole time I was paying a mortgage on a museum because I couldn't let go of you or her or any of it. I didn't move on, I said, and my voice broke on it. I never even started. I disappeared on you because I didn't know how to grieve where you could see me, and it's the great shame of my life, Ruth. You needed me to sit in the dark with you and hurt, and I ran to other people's houses and did trim work instead, because a hammer made sense and your sadness didn't, and I told myself I was providing when I was just hiding. I let you grieve our daughter alone. That's the real reason we broke. It wasn't that the loss was bigger than us. It's that I left you alone in it. And I've known that for 7 years, and I've never once had the courage to say it to your face. She crossed the room, and we stood together over the crib our daughter never slept in the room neither of us could enter alone. And Ruth took my hand. I left you alone in it too, she said. I want you to know that. I've had 7 years to understand it wasn't all you. When you disappeared into work, I let you. I could have chased you. I could have stood in the doorway of your shop and said, don't you dare grieve her without me. And I didn't, because I was drowning too. And it was easier to be angry at you for leaving than to admit I'd stopped reaching. We did it to each other. Ethan, we both went numb and called it the end because grieving together was the one thing neither of us was brave enough to do. We stayed in that room a long time. And we finally did the thing we should have done 7 years ago. The thing that might have saved us if we'd known how we grieved Junie together, out loud, in her room, over her crib. Ruth told me things she'd never told me. About the day it happened, about being a labor and delivery nurse who spent every shift bringing other people's babies safely into the world and couldn't bring her own. I told her about the crib, about how I'd put it under the tarp because looking at it was like looking directly at the sun. We cried, both of us, in a way we'd each done alone in the dark for 7 years and never once done in the same room. And it was the hardest hour of my life, and it was the thing that finally, after 7 years, began to heal the wound instead of just guarding it. When we could finally talk again, the light through the little window had gone gold and low, and I said, the new owners close tomorrow. Ruth looked at the crib. I know, you're going to hand them the keys. She was quiet for a long moment, and then she said, I don't want to. And she looked at me, wrecked and hoping at once, the same look she'd given me across the street 7 years ago that I'd been too numb to answer. Ethan, I don't want to sell it. I never wanted to sell it. I only called the realtor because I thought forcing it gone was the only way to stop living like this. But standing here with you, I don't think the house was ever the problem. The house is the only place we were ever happy. I think the problem was that we were both trying to carry it alone. She took a breath. I don't know how to ask you what I'm about to ask you. It's been 7 years. But I don't want to hand this house to strangers. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life across town from you both pretending a thing we buried is dead. So I'm asking, could we don't sell it? I said. She stopped. Call the realtor tonight. Tell them it's off. I put my hand on the crib rail, the wood I'd started and she'd finished. The two of us in one object without either of us knowing it. I'm not scared of this room anymore, Ruth. That's what 7 years alone teaches you. The room was never the thing I couldn't face. It was facing it alone. I'd rather stand in this room with you every day for the rest of my life and hurt when we need to hurt than spend one more night being fine by myself across town. It was never over. We just quit. And I am so tired of the long way around. She broke completely, and I pulled Ruth Delgado against my chest and held her the way I should have held her 7 years ago, in the room where our daughter's crib stood finished and empty and loved, and we stood there while the gold light faded. Two people who'd frozen a still living thing in place and finally decided to thaw it out. We didn't fix 7 years in one afternoon. I want to be honest about that, because the version where one day in a house heals everything is a lie, and there's too much real in this to cheapen it. She called the realtor that night and killed the sale, and the man was annoyed, and neither of us cared. But we went slow after that, genuinely slow, on purpose, because we'd both learned exactly what it costs to skip the hard things. We didn't just move me back in and pretend the 7 years hadn't happened. We started over, carefully, like people who knew each other's whole history and still had to learn who they'd each become in the years apart. I was angry sometimes. Under the joy, grief has a long tail, and so does regret. And she had her own reckoning, the guilt of the frozen house, the years she'd spent guarding a museum. That didn't dissolve because of one good afternoon. It took time. It's still, some days, taking time. But we did the work, because we'd finally learned what not doing it costs. We went, together, to talk to someone, the kind of help we should have gotten 7 years earlier instead of a divorce lawyer. The kind that might have saved us the whole gray decade if either of us had been brave enough to walk in the door back when it mattered. We grieved Junie properly, together, over months, the way we'd started to in her room. And slowly, carefully, I moved back into the house on Cedar Street, my love letter in wood, the home I'd built and couldn't enter, the place we'd been happy and then been ruined, and were now, impossibly, learning to be happy in again. The little room at the top of the stairs, we didn't empty, and we didn't turn into a shrine either. We made it Junie's room, in a new way, a small, quiet room with her finished crib in it, and a chair by the window where either of us can sit when we need to be close to her, and a soft green wall we decided to keep. Because you don't paint over the thing that hurt you and pretend it wasn't there. You just decide to stop keeping the whole rest of the house frozen around it. Grief gets one room. It doesn't get the whole home. We remarried a year and a half after that October afternoon, in the front room, by the window seat I'd built her, with just our families there. Ruth wore a green dress, the color of the little room, though I don't think anyone but the two of us knew why. And that night, in the house we'd almost handed to strangers, I lay awake next to my wife and listened to the particular quiet of a house I'd built settling around the two of us, and I thought about how close we'd come to selling the only place we were ever whole, to strangers who'd have cleared out that room without ever knowing what it held. I hadn't stepped inside that house in 7 years. Now I run my hand over its trim every day. The work I did when we were young and happy and had no idea what was coming. There's a room at the top of the stairs with a walnut crib in it that I started and Ruth finished. 2 halves of the same grief that turned out to be 2 halves of the same love. And some nights, when the weight of everything we lost gets heavy, one of us takes the other's hand, and we climb the stairs I built and sit in that room together, which is the one thing 7 years of silence taught us to do, because the room was never what either of us couldn't face. It was facing it alone, and we're not doing that anymore. She whispered, "Come home with me," just this once. It turned out to be the bravest thing either of us ever said, and the least true because I didn't come home just once. I came home for good, to a house I built and a woman I never stopped loving, and a little green room we'll never empty, and I am never taking the long way around again.